Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming out for today's presentation. My name is Blake Moran. For those of you whom I haven't had the chance to meet, I'm Dean of the Law School, and it's indeed a pleasure for me to introduce today's speaker. I'm sure you've read the placards about today's speaker, but it only gives you a real hint of the truly remarkable talent that our colleague has. I will say this to you. When we were engaged in a search nationally for one of the most prominent entry-level hires that the law school could make, and we had a number of individuals that we either spoke with or interviewed, there was one individual who came forward who was really in demand all over the country. As a matter of fact, when I went to national dean's meetings, they would talk about this very young candidate who was a graduate of Howard University for his bachelor's, had gone to the University of Kentucky for his PhD, had graduated from Cornell Law School, and was at Cornell Law School doing amazing research work as well as teaching. And everybody at this national meeting was talking about this remarkable young man who already had a publication record envious of many very seasoned law professors. This individual, I will tell you, had choices all over the country, and he came to Wake Forest. And there are many times in a person's professional life where you can look back and say, you know, here was a pivotal moment in my career. One of them in my career was really getting this individual to come to Wake Forest. And he has indeed showed all the potential that he possibly had. I could list for you today all of the publications that he's done. If I did that, you wouldn't hear him speak today. But let me just say this one thing about this individual. Today, we're dealing in a society where the complexities of the political system have never been more Byzantine, where the conversations about difficult issues, whether they have to do with the economy, whether it has to do with jobs, whether it has to do with sociological kinds of issues such as race, politics of class. Here's a voice of an individual who's willing to cut through the rhetoric and get really to the true issues that we should be focusing on in making good decisions in this difficult time. Now today he's going to talk about his latest book, which has to do with Alpha Phi Alpha. For those of you who don't know Alpha Phi Alpha very well, it is the oldest historically predominantly African American fraternity in the country. I'm proud to be a member of Alpha Phi Alpha, and there's several others in the room who are as well. And he's written a book to talk about the historic context of that fraternity. And as you listen to his words, I want you to concentrate on two things. Number one, you're going to hear from an individual whose remarkable research skills and all of his insights are very telling about very pivotal issues today. That's one. Secondly, you're going to hear about a fraternal organization that is not one that's devoted to a social cause, but really one that's devoted to uplifting society. For those of you who don't know the Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity very well. And it really is a template for what we need in this country today. And thirdly of all, you're going to recognize that all of this is being said by an individual, a young individual, with the insight of someone who is far beyond his years. So without further ado, it's a pleasure for me to welcome to the podium Professor Gregory Parks.
Thank you so much for all of you who came out. Let me first start by talking a little bit about myself, my interest in Alpha, and how it developed. Before I do all that, I want to thank my research assistants, because they have been wonderful, particularly the research assistants that worked with me over the summer and last year. Mr. Paul Derhanessian, who is a third-year law student, Mr. Janak Bagher, where are you? Right here. Ms. Kara Medijov, who is over there, and one who I don't see out there, Ms. Rachel Lord. The last three are actually undergraduate RAs that I have. Well, I went to Howard University for my undergraduate education. And when I got to Howard, of course, it being an HBCU, many students would ask, so what fraternity might you join? What sorority might you join? And my response was, I'm gonna join Me Phi Me. Because fraternities are nonsensical. I'm not gonna let someone beat me to call me their brother. And that was my mantra for my freshman year. Towards the end of that academic year, my brother-in-law, who was older than me, my sister is 8 years older than me, my brother-in-law is about a year or two older than her, he went to Bucknell, where they didn't have Black Greek-led organizations or BGLOs, and so he did not join a fraternity. But he heard that you could actually join a BGLO through an alumni chapter, and so he sought to join Alpha Phi Alpha, and then after he was initiated, actually went in and did some extracurricular stuff, old-fashioned process as well. And he insisted that I join the organization, and I said, there's no way that I'm going to join a fraternity. So he asked me if I'd do him a favor. He asked if I would read Alpha's history book written by the luminary historian Charles Harris Wesley. So I agreed to read the history book. I read it, and I was impressed by the woven tapestry of Martin Luther King, Thurgood Marshall, Lyman T. Johnson, ultimately at the University of Kentucky, who desegregated the University of Kentucky's graduate school, and many other luminary African American and non-African American men. And so I thought about it for a while, and ultimately I sought to join Alpha, and I didn't think that I would be as intensely devoted to the organization and its ideals. I went to graduate school to earn my PhD in clinical psychology at the University of Kentucky. And when I got there was a professor by the name of Tamara Brown, who was starting her first year teaching there the year I was starting my first year as a graduate student. Tamara, Dr. Brown, was a member of Delta Sigma Theta sorority, the second oldest Black sorority. And we had a conversation about our respective organizations and the fact that despite them having existed for almost 100 years, there had been very little, almost nil, scholarly research conducted on them. And so we set about to publish maybe an article on BGLOs, specifically focused on all the contentious issues surrounding hazing within these organizations. We waited some time, and then we ultimately decided that we would write a book, and then we decided we'd edited a book because we thought it might be useful to have interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary perspectives on these organizations. And so that's what we did. And our first book was published in 2005 by the University Press of Kentucky. Now, at the time, I thought this will be my first, last, and only book on Black Greek-led organizations. I intend to go to law school. I can't imagine having time to write while in law school. And I want to be a law professor. And I can't imagine any law school letting me do research on Black fraternities and sororities. And so after the first book came out, I would get lots of emails from BGLO members asking, have you thought about this issue? Have you thought about that issue? And I said, well, I hadn't. Nobody's ever addressed them, and now since I'm thinking about them, I guess I might as well edit another book on the topic to address these issues. And so that's how the second book came about. I went to law school, and ultimately I decided, and maybe I'll publish a couple more things on the topic before I get out on the legal academic market. But things changed in two ways. One is while in law school, I met or knew a wonderful Alpha brother from Washington, D.C., who was the first Black partner at his law firm. And he recruited me to come work for that law firm, which I did ultimately. After law school, I went to clerk for a judge on the D.C. Court of Appeals who knew a lot about Alpha Phi Alpha, that since she was a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority incorporated, the first Black sorority. The next year, I went and clerked for a judge on a court that sits just below the U.S. Supreme Court. A brother, Alpha, wonderful man by the name of Judge Andre M. Davis. And then I had numerous Alpha brothers who were in the legal academy, are in the legal academy, to sort of guide my steps to this point to another Alpha brother, Dean Blake Moran. When I went on the academic market, interestingly, almost every law school said, you know, your research on unconscious bias in the law is interesting, But what I really want to know about is what is up with this fraternity research? And I had, a half-hearted answer. I planned on abandoning the topic. But then after I gave a talk at Cornell Law School where I had graduated, the faculty there said, there is something interesting here from a legal perspective. One is, why do people with so much to lose, not simply 18, 19, 20-year-olds, but why do individuals who are doctors, who are lawyers, who are physicians, who are pastors, so thoroughly endorse the violent hazing culture within these organizations when there's so much that they have to risk? And secondly, there seems to be a wonderful story here to tell about men and women over the generations who, through their organizations, or at least through their organizational ideals, committed themselves to the race and sought to bring about racial equality, in part through the law, civil rights litigation, and trying to shape public policy. But now to the heart of the matter, and that is this book. To me, Alpha is a wonderful organization. I have drunk the Kool-Aid, as they say. I think that Alpha, like other BGLOs, are exceptional organizations, but I think Alpha is certainly the most exceptional among them all. And the question for me was, what were these organizations intended to be? They seem particularly complex. At the individual level, it seems as though the members are expected to be a mixture of academic excellence and individuals who have strong racial identity. At the intermediate level, they seem to be organizations that are dedicated to developing, fostering, and maintaining fictive kinship ties among people across generations and across not simply the country but the globe, since we have international chapters. And then third, they seem like organizations that are focused on the uplift of the race through community service, philanthropy, civic action, and shaping public policy. This is a story that has largely gone untold. And so for me, the question was not simply what are these elements, but to what extent does, in my mind, the penultimate organization reflect these ideals? And to the extent that it doesn't reflect them the way that the founders had intended for the organization to reflect these ideals, how do we get that organization back on track? So with that in mind, I'll read some excerpts from the book, and then I've never done a reading, so I'll try not to go too far in the reading, but then I'll open it up for some Q&A. Let me take some stuff from the introduction, because I think it helps set the tone for the book. Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, the sole intercollegiate Black Greek letter organization, BGLO, to be founded at an Ivy League institution, had its beginnings at the turn of the 20th century at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. At the nadir of American race relations and just a year after the Niagara Conference, the precursor to the NAACP, 7 young Black men sought to build a brotherhood. On Tuesday, December 4th, 1906, they did just that. They founded a fraternity predicated on personal excellence, largely demonstrated by high academic achievement, the development and maintenance of meaningful fictive kinship ties, and engagement in racial uplift largely demonstrated by civic action, community service, the shaping of public policy and philanthropy. It is no wonder that many of the most renowned African American leaders of the 20th and 21st centuries were and are sons of Alpha. But as great as Alpha has been, it is important to take stock of what the organization is today. The current study of Alpha is in line with Black historiography. The literature has done well to recognize and even celebrate Alpha as a leader among fraternal networks. It is now time to critically evaluate the organization. The editors and contributing authors to this volume understand that doing so will not be easy and could very well be controversial, and it has been, which is why they take to heart the fraternity's aims: manly deeds, scholarship with an emphasis on scholarship, and love for all mankind. Advancing scholarship of Alpha to the point of critical introspection allows the fraternity to further develop. It allows the brothers to transcend. In his seminal work on the history of Alpha Phi Alpha, Charles Harris Wesley identifies a unique period in the fraternity's evolution, a period of organizational introspection. It was 1914 when, according to Wesley, the leading desire was internal development, and the searchlight of criticism was therefore turned upon the fraternity itself. According to Wesley, such self-examination was typical during this period, occasioning deep reflection and sometimes bordering on intensive criticism. This mode of thinking was not the dominant approach among Alpha men in contemplating and working on behalf of the fraternity. Rather, a small group of Alpha brothers, thinkers in Wesley's words, became the leaven which ultimately leavened the whole. During this age of introspection, this group of thinkers became concerned with a host of issues. Among them was a desire to ensure that the fraternity did not become a self-congratulatory organization with a frivolous agenda. In essence, the concern was best summed up as follows: whither are we drifting? In more than 95 years, there has been little record of Alpha men engaging in a systematic introspection with regard to the fraternity. It is not the editor's contention, however, that since 1914 Alpha men have engaged in no deep reflection on the nature and function of Alpha. The truth is likely to be quite the contrary. If recent decades are any indication, as evidenced by debates among Alpha men at fraternity conventions and on fraternity listservs, some organizational self-reflection has probably taken place since the very beginning of the organization. The editor's point is that there is no record of Alpha men engaging in systematic, for example, incorporating all relevant facts and data, and critical, for example, wholly accepting the possibility that the fraternity may have a host of weaknesses and faults, self-examination. The editor's agenda is toward this end. This is an age in which facts and data are highly accessible, especially those that are of great significance to Alpha's future. In very general terms, disciplines such as history, African American studies, organizational behavior, psychology, law, sociology, higher education, and economics all have something to contribute to a robust understanding of Alpha. Within the past decade, academicians and practitioners have contributed greatly to our understanding of BGLOs, in general and by inference, Alpha Phi Alpha. Whereas scholarly books and journal articles on the topic of BGLOs were once scarce, they now abound. Further, when taken in toto, they span a broad array of topics germane to Alpha's future. It is not certain, however, that Alpha incorporates its scholarship in its daily affairs and long-term strategic planning. So this is the agenda of the book. I had started the book as the sole editor, and then I went on the legal academic job market and quickly realized I needed a co-editor. Time was a limited resource at that point. So thankfully, fraternity brother Stephen M. Bradley, a history professor at St. Louis University, jumped aboard to assist me, and ably assist me. And then the vast majority of the contributing authors are Alpha brothers, though we did invite some non-Alphas to contribute on chapters. Let me read a bit from the second chapter, defining the Alpha identity. I had a great deal of fun writing this chapter with Felix Armfield, who's a history professor at Buffalo State College, Stephen Bradley, Kenneth Clark, who is the chaplain at Cornell University, and Jeremy Harp, a young brother. When he first started on this project, he was an undergrad at Yale, and now he runs a nonprofit in Atlanta, getting predominantly African American youth into elite universities. So we start out like this. We ask, what is Alpha? Inasmuch as Alpha, the organization, is defined by the sum total of its membership, what is an Alpha? The word Alpha is defined as the beginning, the first. It is also the highest ranked or most dominant individual of one sex, for example, the alpha male. Kate Ludeman and Eddie Erlinson's work on alpha males in corporate settings is instructive in this regard. And my alpha brothers can acknowledge or not acknowledge the extent to which this characterizes us. They analyzed a host of alpha male attributes and evaluated the value and risk of those attributes to an organization. They found that alpha males are self-confident and opinionated. They act decisively and have good intuition, but they are closed-minded, domineering, and can be intimidating. Alpha males are also highly intelligent and have the ability to see beyond the obvious and take creative leaps, but they dismiss or demean colleagues who disagree with them. That's certainly not the case with my dean. They are action-oriented and produce results. But they also are impatient and resist changes that might improve results. Alpha males have high performance expectations for themselves and others, and set and achieve high goals, but they are frequently dissatisfied and fail to appreciate and motivate others. Moreover, they have a direct communication style and an ability to move people to action, but they generate a fear and gossip-filled cover-your-back culture of compliance. Alpha males are highly disciplined and extremely productive, but they have unreasonable expectations of themselves and others and often miss signs of burnout. Further, they are unemotional, laser-focused, and objective. They are difficult to connect with and do not inspire teamwork. Although these defining features may be helpful in understanding members of Alpha and the fraternity itself, the definitional failure lies in the fact that Alpha is not simply a corporation that we're incorporating. Rather, as the authors argue later, it is a confluence of multiple identities. According to Ludeman and Erlinson's corporate alpha male description may be instructive. Accordingly, Ludeman and Erlinson's corporate alpha male description may be instructive, but it is also both over and under inclusive with regard to the attributes applicable to Alpha Phi Alpha men. This chapter proceeds from where Sekou Burmese is a business school professor at the University of Texas, an Alpha brother who wrote the first chapter on what is organizational identity and what does it mean for Alpha. And so, as we say, this chapter proceeds from where Burmese's chapter on organizational identity ends, employing his construct in an attempt to make sense of Alpha's identity. A plethora of methodologies avail themselves to the authors, each adding nuance to our understanding of Alpha. One of the most useful and robust methods would be to analyze the Alpha initiation ritual. Although it has evolved over time, it is arguable that the themes have remained constant since its creation, dating back to the fraternity's founding in 1906. Because it's a secret document, brothers don't get uptight. A public analysis would be repugnant to any notion of decency and is thus precluded. An alternative is to analyze publicly available documents such as the fraternity's Esprit de Fraternité, as well as the mission and vision statements. The Esprit de Fraternité, written by Charles H. Garvin, Alpha's fourth general president, reads, "An Alpha Phi Alpha man's attitude should not be how much can I derive from the fraternity, but how much can I do for the fraternity. In proportion to what he does for his chapter and for Alpha Phi Alpha, will a member receive lasting benefits from the fraternity, to himself in the way of self-development by duty well done, and the respect of the brothers well served. A member's duties should be prompt payment of all financial obligations, the prime requisite of successful fraternal life, the doing of good scholastic work and his chosen vocation, thereby accomplishing the real end of a college course, the reasonable endeavor to participate in general college activities and social service and to excel therein, the proper consideration of all things with appropriate attention to high moral standard of Alpha Phi Alpha." And so in the chapter we've moved from here to there. We talk about the poems that Alpha men are required to memorize when they're online, If and Invictus by Rudyard Kipling and William Ernest Henley respectively. and what those poems should convey to an individual. Keep a stiff upper lip, that your life, your achievements are yours, and so you can't blame your lack of accomplishment on anybody else. Your fate is in your hand. I am the master of my fate, I am the captain of my soul, which William Ernest Henley so eloquently noted. We look to other alpha poems to see what they convey about what an alpha man should be. We look to Alpha's hymn to see what the hymn says we should be. Then interestingly, we draw from a study that actually is in the second edition of my first book, which comes out later this month. And that study looks at the perceptions or stereotypes that women in black sororities have about men in black fraternities and how that relates to mate preferencing or social interaction preferencing. And so we steal some of that and place it here. And so let me read that because it's interesting. Actually, the reason why we, or my colleagues wrote that article is because of a chant that alphas often use when they're pledges or once they're initiated. And it goes like this. An alpha is what a kappa ain't, what a Q wanna be, what a sigma can't, what a zeta like, what a delta love, what a AKA can't get enough of. That's right. In addition to poems and songs, chants, often public humorous displays of banter with other black Greek letter fraternities provide some insight into the alpha identity. One such chant is the one I noted. To gain any insight into the comparative analysis, one must first ascertain the identities of members of Kappa Alpha Psi, Kappa Omega Psi Phi, Q, and Phi Beta Sigma Sigma. Ricky Jones, in his book Black Haze, discusses some of the stereotypes associated with different BGLO, Black Greek letter fraternities, BGLFs. He describes Kappas as being, and Ricky Jones is a Kappa himself, Ricky Jones describes Kappas as being widely stereotyped as somewhat arrogant, smooth-talking ladies' men. He describes the Qs as being stereotyped as the most boisterous, rambunctious of the BGLF members. Further, Jones says many members, younger ones especially, can regularly be seen adorning dog collars, spray-painted gold boots and purple laces, and military camouflage pants to reinforce the hardcore, wild persona. According to Jones, the Sigma stereotype is that of eschewing bourgeois inclinations and membership based on elitist exclusivity. As such, the Sigmas have a more diverse, if not diffuse, membership identity. It should be noted that no theory has been put forth vis-a-vis stereotypes of Iota Phi Theta members, the last of the black fraternities to join the umbrella organization they joined in 1963, and we know that this is possibly because there's such a new organization. Qualitative research finds that many Kappas hold firm to the pretty boy, ladies' man identity, while Qs hold fast to the identity of a dog and a man's man. Juxtaposing these identities, Lawrence Otis Graham, in his book Our Kind of People about the black upper class, described the alpha stereotype as follows. An alpha is professionally ambitious, bookish, not overly gregarious, and safe. My father-in-law, who pledged Alpha in 1947, says he's the mensch, the nice guy that everyone wants his sister to date. I raise eyebrows at. The pervasiveness of these stereotypes is bolstered by quantitative research on black Greek letter sorority stereotypes about BGLFs and the women's social interaction preferences with regard to such fraternity men. For example, in one study, all four sororities, Alpha Kappa Alpha, Delta Sigma Theta, Zeta Phi Beta, and Sigma Gamma Rho, most often associated Kappas with the labels ladies' man and lover. Qs were linked with notions of a man's man, anti-intellectual, masculine, ideal sexual partner. By contrast, Alphas were labeled gentlemen and the ideal escort to a social event. While Delta Sigma Theta and Zeta Phi Beta members most often attributed the label nice guy to Sigmas, Alpha Kappa Alpha and Sigma Gamma Rho members most often attributed that label to Alphas. All four sororities most often associated the label friend with Sigmas, but Alpha Kappa Alpha members equally ascribed that label to Alphas. Although Zeta Phi Beta members most often assign the label husband, ideal husband, to members of their brother fraternity, which is Phi Beta Sigma. Of course, the dean's wife would not say that. Members of the other three sororities most often correlated the descriptor ideal husband with an alpha male. So in this chapter, we take all of these approaches, and then in the end we say, well, the problem with these approaches is that they all come after the founding of the organization. So it could be simply that brothers or people who have stereotypes of these various organizations are putting a certain sheen or gloss on respective organizations, including Alpha Phi Alpha. So the question for us was simply to look at the confluence of factors and institutions that gave rise to Alpha Phi Alpha. The first was the nadir of American race relations, which spanned from the end of the Civil War, Reconstruction, up to the 20s, some might have said up to the 40s. It's the low point of American race relations, according to historian Rayford Logan, who was a former president, a general president of Alpha Phi Alpha, and noted historian. And so we argue that the needs of the race, racial exclusion, racial intimidation, is one factor that gave rise to an organization that was, according to one of Alpha's founders, Henry Arthur Callis, when he said society offered us narrowly circumscribed opportunity and no security. Out of our need, our fraternity brought social purpose and social action. We also indicate that there are various institutional effects. One is being born on an Ivy League campus in upstate New York and having gone to Cornell in the 2000s and it being secluded then. I can imagine how secluded it might have been for black students at the turn of the 20th century, even though Cornell is known for having been, even back then, an inclusive institution. One scholar wrote a recent book entitled Part and Yet Apart about the black experience at Cornell from the 1865 through, I believe, the 1940s. Yes, they were part of the university, but they really were apart from the university. And Howard University, the mecca of black higher education that was committed to W. Du Bois' notion of the talented tenth, uplifting the race. Du Bois, who was a member of the Niagara Conference, the precursor to the NAACP, which, according to Jewel, founder of Alpha, Henry Arthur Callis, was an inspiration for the founders back in 1905 to found the fraternity in 1906. So much so, the connection was evident that Du Bois, in a visit to the University of Michigan, was initiated into the Epsilon chapter of Alpha Phi Alpha in 1909. As you can see, I'm pretty high on Alpha. Let me jump a little bit and read a couple of excerpts from some biographies. And the reason why I want to read these excerpts of these five particular general presidents is because, Brother Morant, I'm actually going to write a book on these general presidents. Books, they just keep popping out. So, and my question with regard to these gentlemen is, how do we look at different models of black leadership focused on uplifting the race? One model is that of a pure scholar. Another model is that of a scholar and activist. Another model is that of a civil rights litigator. Another model is that of a civil rights activist who doesn't have a JD, but working through organizations like the NAACP. And then the last is that of a publisher who uses his newspaper to uplift the race. So let me read a couple of quick biographies. Actually, this is the longest chapter in the book, written by Brother Andre McKenzie, who's an administrator at St. John's University. When he sent it to me, it was about 140 pages. So it is the one chapter that's eaten up a lot of the book. So let me first read a little bit about Charles Harris Wesley. Elected in December 1931, noted historian, educator, and author, Charles Harris Wesley served as the fraternity's 14th general president. He held this position until December 1940, constituting the longest tenure of any man to serve as general president of Alpha Phi Alpha. Born December 2nd, 1891 in Louisville, Kentucky, Wesley attended independent schools affiliated with the Presbyterian Church in his early years and went on to graduate from Louisville Central High School. At the age of 15, he entered Fisk University and earned an A.B. degree in 1911. Let's stop the chapters. While at Fisk, he played 4 varsity sports, traveled and sang with the Fisk Jubilee Singers, and graduated Phi Beta Kappa. In 1913, he received an M.A. degree in History and Economics from Yale University. While at Yale, Wesley was initiated into the second charter group of the fraternity Zeta chapter on March 29, 1913. After he finished his master's, he applied to law school. This isn't in the chapter. He applied to law school and got into Harvard Law School. But his mother fell gravely ill, so he had to go to law school. He had to head back to Louisville. He later joined the faculty at Howard University's Department of History and Modern Languages after taking the sabbatical leave during the 1920-1921 academic year. Wesley pursued a PhD in history at Harvard University, which he completed in 1925, making him the 4th African American ever to get a PhD from Harvard. The first would be W. Du Bois. Named a historian emeritus by the fraternity, Wesley authored The History of Alpha Phi Alpha, Development in College Life, the first such history of Black Greek letter college societies. The first edition of the history was presented in 1929. Wesley was very active in other fraternal organizations. He was a 33rd degree Mason. He was a grand historian for Sigma Pi Phi, also known as the Boule, probably the most exclusive and selective Black fraternity, older than Alpha actually by a couple of years. And then he became the president of Central State University. Rayford Logan. In his inaugural address as the fraternity's 15th general president, Rayford Whittingham Logan remarked, "The presidency of Alpha Phi Alpha is no mere honor, but rather an opportunity for service." Even prior to his election, Logan's commitment to service and advancement of Negroes in all parts of the world had been firmly established. He was forceful and outspoken advocate of equality and civil rights, both domestic and international, and used the fraternity as a primary vehicle to express his activism. Born on January 7, 1897 in Washington, D.C., Logan was a highly gifted student, valedictorian of his graduating class from the district's M Street High School. He went on to matriculate at the University of Pittsburgh. Though Logan remained at Pittsburgh for only a year, while there he was initiated into the fraternity's Omicron chapter in 1914. He later transferred to Williams College, where he received his bachelor's degree in 1917. The day following his commencement, Logan enlisted as in the first separate battalion of the District of Columbia's National Guard. He later earned a master's degree from Williams and a doctorate of philosophy degree from Harvard University, which was in history. During his presidency, Logan was on the faculty of Howard University's Department of History, and he served as its chairman until his retirement in 1964. One of my favorites actually is Belford V. Lawson. Belford Lawson was the first African American to successfully argue a case before the U.S. Supreme Court. He is the subject of a law review article I'm working on, much to the help of my research assistants, even over winter break. So a little bit about Lawson. Belford Vance Lawson Jr., Alpha's 16th general president, was described as the quintessence of class, urbanity, style, grace, eloquence, and wit. Born on July 9, 1901 in Roanoke, Virginia, Lawson was one of 11 children. After attending the Ferris Institute in Big Rapids, Michigan, he pursued undergraduate studies at the University of Michigan. In 1922, initiated the fraternity's Epsilon chapter. Lawson demonstrated his athletic prowess as the institution's first Black varsity football player. After graduating in 1924, he taught at Morris Brown College before attending law school at Yale University, where he completed 2 years of study. Depleted of finances, he headed to Washington, D.C., where he was employed by the Supreme Liberty Life Insurance Company. Lawson earned his LLB degree, his law degree. from Howard University School of Law in 1932. Soon thereafter, he opened a private law office in the District of Columbia, where he practiced law for 44 years, a lot of that being civil rights litigation. Two more. A. Maceo Smith. When asked to reflect on his journey to the general presidency of Alpha, Antonio Maceo Smith recalled the night of his 1924 initiation in Nashville, Tennessee. That evening, Smith and 3 other Fisk University seniors entered the fraternity through Chi chapter at Meharry Medical College. Due to Fisk's refusal to recognize fraternities and sororities at the time, doing so placed all 4 students' graduation in jeopardy. It was that night in the upper room of the old YMCA that Smith was imbued with a burning conviction and fervent determination to ever hold high the lofty ideals of the fraternity. And so his journey began. Alpha's 17th general president was born April 16, 1903, in Texarkana, Texas. Smith earned a bachelor's degree from Fisk in 1924 and a master's degree in business from NYU in 1928. While in New York, Smith worked as a red cap at the Grand Central Station to help support himself, and later organized an advertising agency based in Harlem. He affiliated with the Brothers of Ada chapter, where he served as house manager and business manager of the chapter's basketball team. Smith returned to Texas in 1929 to start a career in business. His involvement and leadership in a series of successful attacks on Jim Crow practices and customs in Dallas began in 1933. He organized the Negro Chamber of Commerce and, as part of the Texas Centennial celebration in 1936, an exposition on Negro life and culture described as the greatest thing done on the Negro. His leadership extended to the Dallas unit of the NAACP, where he was appointed its first executive secretary, and the Texas County Council of Negro Organizations. And lastly, let me talk about Frank Stanley. Brothers in Alpha Phi Alpha predict that the reign of Brother Frank Stanley will advance the cause of Alpha. This prophecy, voiced by the Sphinx in February 1955, was a response to the election of Frank Laverne Stanley as the fraternity's 18th general president in December 1954. Born on April 5, 1905 in Chicago, Stanley moved with his family to Louisville, Kentucky, when he was 6 years old. After graduating from Louisville Central High School, he entered Atlanta University, where he was initiated into the fraternity's Alpha Pi chapter. In addition to his fraternal involvement, Stanley's extracurricular pursuits included serving as student council president of his class, and captain of the football and basketball teams, on the varsity debate team, and the editor of The Scroll. An English major with a minor in journalism, he later attended graduate school at the University of Cincinnati. At the time of his election, Stanley was owner and publisher of the Louisville Defender, a publication geared toward the interests and needs of the city's black populace. After teaching college and high school English for 5 years, he joined the newspaper staff in 1933 as a writer of editorials and features. The Defender was heavily involved in struggles on behalf of blacks for teacher salary equalization, admission to labor unions, election to public office, and appointments to high-level government positions and policy-making boards. During Stanley's tenure, the publication won more than 70 national and state awards. So what I mean to convey by these stories, and certainly you will see this in the stories of other general presidents, and certainly the stories about the founders, is that these were men of great talent. They could go somewhere and make lots of money and live a pretty easy life. But to a great extent, they were men who were committed to the uplift of the race, and who used their time and talents to do just that. You have to leave, Brother Moran? Let me read a little bit from 2 other places, and then we can do some Q&A. Let me read a little bit about, since I am a law professor, I should read something about law and Alpha. So I'll read a little bit from the chapter on civil rights, and then I'll try to read a little bit from the conclusion. Some say the conclusion is ominous, but I think it's just a warning. The fraternity must remain committed to its founding ideals. But I'll read from a chapter written by Robert Weems, who's a Alpha Brotherhood history professor at Wichita State University. This chapter examines Alpha Phi Alpha's involvement in the 20th century Black freedom struggle. Alpha's role in this phenomenon consisted of two distinct and sometimes interconnected dynamics. First, Alpha Phi Alpha, as an organization, promoted important civil rights initiatives. The fraternity's historic Education for Citizenship campaign, "A voteless people is a hopeless people," exemplifies this reality. In addition, Alpha Phi Alpha sought to positively influence public policy as it relates to persons of African descent. Second, individual members of Alpha Phi Alpha assumed leadership positions in the broad-based struggle for African American freedom, justice, and equality. Such persons include W.E.B. Du Bois, Rayford Logan, Charles Hamilton Houston, Thurgood Marshall, Belford Lawson, Jonathan Franklin, Martin Luther King, Paul Robeson, Dick Gregory, Adam Clinton Powell Jr., and Whitney Young. It should be noted that notwithstanding the fraternity's well-documented participation in the struggle for civil rights, some members of the organization prioritized social activity over social action. Nevertheless, the evidence suggests that the majority of Alphas were conscious supporters of the campaign to end American apartheid. Alpha Phi Alpha's interest in racial advancement and civil rights did not occur by happenstance. As Charles Harris Wesley asserts in the introduction of his history on the fraternity, the establishment of Alpha was an important manifestation of African American institution building in the first decade of the 20th century. Moreover, this period of organizational activity included not just groups concerned with economic issues, such as the Negro Business League, but also groups concerned with civil and human rights, such as the Niagara Conference or the Niagara Movement. Although Ithaca, New York was and remains a fairly isolated locale with a limited African American presence, the young men who founded Alpha Phi Alpha on the campus of Cornell University were well aware of the problems the national Black community faced during this period. As Jewel Callis asserted, society, as I noted, offered us African Americans narrowly circumscribed opportunity, no security out of our need. Our fraternity brought social purpose and social action. Moreover, Wesley amplified Callis's observation by contending the later history of the fraternity reveals this social purpose conceived by a small group of college men in a single location developed into the program of the first of the collegiate fraternities, and many locations for the fulfillment of this original purpose. Roscoe C. Giles was actually one of the first initiates to the fraternity through Alpha chapter, but at that time there were no other chapters, so the fraternity was in toto at Cornell University. Giles was also the first African American to graduate from Cornell Medical School. So Giles, the second general president of Alpha Phi Alpha, provided an early reinforcement of Alpha's original purpose, promoting social purpose and social action. In 1915, he stated that the fraternity, as an organization, must do more than just meet, eat, sleep, resolve, and adjourn. Moreover, he declared no more representative, no more intelligent, no more worthy men exist in the fraternal bond in the world today than we boast of within our ranks. We must arouse the slumbering giant, Ethiopia. And let me close with a couple of remarks from the conclusion. Try to see what might be best to close on. Let me say this. In sum, Alpha has a complex identity comprising the organization, as I have indicated and is indicated throughout the book. Just as the organizations that inform the Alpha identity face challenges, so too does Alpha Phi Alpha. As the fraternity moves forward toward another 100 years, the editor suggests that it do a few things to remain relevant, and even more important, to remain faithful to its founding precepts. Alpha must be a proud but deeply humble organization, composed of similarly humble members. The Brotherhood should be aware of its historic accomplishments, but realize that significant work remains to be done. Alpha must avoid the prospect of relying on its past. Before others do so for the fraternity, Alpha must purposefully define its current and future place in society. Further, Alpha should appreciate its own complexity and draw from a broad body of knowledge to address its own and society's challenges. This requires that the fraternity to effectively and consistently draw on its intellectual capital. The fraternity needs to invest in its members, especially its college members, to make the college brothers more useful to the fraternity and to society. And the N Alpha Phi Alpha, as it has been done in the past, must be visionary in its leadership and unafraid to embrace the truth as it faces the problems of the brotherhood and the world. As we close, we reflect on the words of a noted Alpha man and scholar, E. Franklin Frazier. In his seminal 1957 work, Black Bourgeoisie, Frazier leveled a scathing critique at BGLOs. He claimed that at the time, Black intellectuals used their organizations to gain recognition and power. Fraternity and sorority officials, he asserted, were using their organizations to profit financially, and they did so under the guise of service. Although he provided little evidence for his claims, he continued his criticism by pointing out the fact that these organizations spend exorbitant amounts of money on social activities. Just as Frazier's analysis was both incisive and perspicacious for its time, it was also foreboding for BGLOs. Some BGLO members from Frazier's era quickly dismissed him and his observations, while others searched for what was useful in his critique. Today, we, the contributors and editors of this volume, offer analyses of what we feel is the greatest of all fraternities. It is true that we do not always paint Alpha in the best light in this book, but our critical observations come from an honest desire to see Alpha continue its legacy of greatness. As such, some of our brothers will eschew our analyses and suggestions as illegitimate, but others will at least consider our efforts to advance the organization we hold so dear. Undeniably, if Alpha is to be first of all servants of all and transcend all, the fraternity cannot risk being defined by rhetoric rather than by its efforts to solve real problems for the most vulnerable in society. It cannot satiate its appetite for high society living at a time of massive unemployment, especially for African American men, Alphas included, yet do little to stem the tide of joblessness. It cannot afford to remember the jewels of the founders and Martin Luther King and every other dearly departed luminary Alpha, and not manifest the ideals of those Alpha men. Although Alpha's past is a legendary one, the past will serve to trap Alphas who are self-satisfied with what the fraternity has accomplished, as opposed to what Alpha is accomplishing in real and tangible ways, and how Alpha is executing its vision for the future. If Alpha Phi Alpha is to be all it says it is, it must lead with integrity in a manner that is both proud and humble, visionary yet deliberate. It must be aware of its capabilities yet not bow or cringe before power. Then and only then will Alpha meet the demands of transcendence. Questions? My colleague.
Was hazing one of your critical observations? And with this generation and generations to come have a completely different perspective, we would call them the entitlement generation. Do you think hazing plays a role? How did you reconcile it?
So there are two chapters in the book on hazing. One, to provide some context, hazing within Black fraternities, in particular, Black fraternity sororities more generally, is quite unique for a number of reasons. One is that it is particularly brutal, and it's not a secret, right? Because there are lots of court cases, so you can sit and read court cases. Lots of newspaper articles. So I'm writing a couple of law review articles on the topic, and all I need to do is go look at a newspaper article, a court case, to see the facts there. Though I don't talk about other facts that I might know of from personal experience. So it's particularly violent. The structure of BGLOs is unique in that we have undergraduate chapters like any other fraternity or sorority, but we have highly functioning alumni chapters in many cities, in most cities around the country, where there's a sizable or decent sized Black population, which means that members who graduate from college can go and affiliate with an alumni chapter. And what I mean by highly functioning is also they attend monthly meetings, they do community service projects, they go to fraternity, state, area, and regional and national conventions. In fact, if you go to a national convention for one of the organizations, I'd say 70% of the attendees are alumni members. That's where I see federal judges and law professors who are alphas, and deans of admissions at law schools, and physicians, and congresspersons. But we also initiate members at the alumni level. So it creates a host of challenges for organizations that have particularly violent hazing that is not approved of by the organization and its leadership, but it exists nonetheless in certain pockets, maybe many pockets. So that's the backdrop. So in this book we have two different chapters. The first chapter looks at the ceiling that is and should be placed on hazing within these organizations. We first start with the question of the health of individuals who seek membership. So we look at journal, or the authors of the chapter look at journal articles focused on largely student health and incidents of hazing and what can happen physiologically or psychologically to individuals who are hazed. The second approach is to look at public relations issues within these organizations, or as a result of hazing for the organizations. And then the last and most robust, or two parts. The other is university guidelines. So they did a qualitative study of about 60 universities to see what their constraints on hazing are. And then the last part is the law, what the law has to say. So that tells us what the ceiling is, or should be. Then the last chapter of the book looks at the social, psychological, and organizational behavior research, questioning whether difficult experiences joining an organization actually do commit individuals to each other who will go through the process together, commit individuals to the people who bring them in through that process, and commit the individual to the organization. And that chapter was written by, the first chapter was written by several people from different disciplines. The last chapter was written by an organizational behavior graduate student at the University of Alabama, Alpha brother, Oscar Holmes. And Oscar's argument is, yeah, there are lots of psychological and organizational behavior theories that suggest that difficult experiences are useful to the organizations in many ways, and there's empirical support to suggest that. There has been no study looking at BGLOs, save for a law review article that I'm wrapping up now. And so these provide the challenges for the organization. So the organizations want individuals who are committed to a certain set of ideals, who are committed to each other, who are committed to the people who bring them in, who are committed to being engaged with the organization over the course of their lifespan, and being committed to the community. And so the tension, which I don't think is resolved within the organizations, largely because they don't really have any serious dialogue about the issue, is what benefit can a challenging experience be for the organization? A challenging experience vis-a-vis the members be for the organization, in light of all the constraints that are and should be placed on such a process. Now, with the generation of individuals who feel entitled, that creates some tensions within the organizations, in the sense that, and you might add some nuance to this, maybe I'm not answering this adequately. A critique in the organization is that you have individuals who want to join and make very little sacrifice. And so some members are saying, it's not even being brutalized, it's they don't want to do anything to join. They want to, write the check, fill out the paperwork, and they want to join, and that won't necessarily facilitate the types of commitments that we want for the organization. But the bigger issue is the organization just seem unable to really have an honest dialogue, even within the organizations, about this topic, based on what the facts are, to come up with any real resolution. Does that answer your question?
Did you resolve it for yourself?
Yes and no. Well, for myself as a researcher, or myself as someone who joined the organization?
Whichever you choose to answer.
I was initiated in 1997, and I chose to go back in 1998 and experience the old process. When I was initiated, I liked being an alpha. When I crossed, I loved being an alpha. I probably wouldn't do this kind of research if I hadn't pledged / been hazed. I hold no animosity towards brothers who hazed me. In fact, the most difficult night was probably at the hands of a 2L at Georgetown Law School. I don't think I'd seen him after that night. And he's like associate general counsel for a company. I ran into him in DC. And he's like, hey, I'm married now, I got a house, you need to come down to my man cave. And so we exchanged information. I didn't make it out to his house, but I thought, under any other context and situation, someone would be pissed at this guy. But I would go to his house and hang out and meet his family. It's an odd dynamic. I did an interview with Tavis Smiley for my first book. And Tavis is a member of Kappa Alpha Psi. He said, explain hazing. And I said, this sounds quite perverse, but it's hard to explain hazing. Hazing is like love. You don't understand it unless you experience it. Not saying love is a good thing, because you could be in love with the wrong person, and it hurt like hell. But it's like it in the sense that it's really just hard to articulate exactly what the experience is like. Resolving it at an academic level. I think resolving this issue is a really complex task that involves thinking about it from a legal, sociological, historical, organizational behavior, et cetera, perspective. And I haven't taken the time to do that. But I do plan on writing a book about it this summer with a colleague, Matthew Huey, who's a sociology professor at Mississippi State and a white member of another fraternity, another fraternity brother who's a sociology professor who's a postdoc at Berkeley, and he'll be starting his tenure track job at the University of Maryland. So this is a project that we're actually going to tackle this summer.
The hazing that most of us went through was kind of a brutal thing. You were talking about physical thing, but you can have physical things that aren't the brutal thing. You can make them do something together that requires somebody being beat to death.
Right. Right.
And you can also give them projects that test their intellect and make them do something together that way rather than do the other way.
Right. One thing I had suggested to Alpha was, we say we are solvers of community problems. So during the process by which you bring members in, why not give them complex community problems, like a business school project, and say, solve it. All of you work together. This might involve some sleepless nights. You need to figure out who you're going to call for this part of the issue. If they can't resolve it, who else are you going to call? What kind of resources will you need? And then make it a real problem. Make it a problem that actually exists in the community. And before they're initiated, they have to implement that project. That could be one thing, because it necessitates that they work together, that they be creative, that it's a difficult task. I'm a strong believer that you don't guarantee people membership. Yes, you paid some fee to join the organization, but if you don't pass this proficiency test on the organization's history and structure, if you don't know what's expected to be known, if you don't demonstrate brotherhood and sisterhood, if you're not willing to sacrifice for these individuals over the course of this 4-week, 8-week process, you're definitely not going to sacrifice for them on the opposite end. And so, there's no guarantee that you'll be a member. You have to show us that you have the qualities and characteristics of a member of this organization in order to be initiated. So, back here.
The slideshow, the significance of the 2 Egyptian pharaohs.
Right. So, this was interesting. At the turn of the 20th century, you had young black students at Cornell University who wanted to import elements of Afrocentricity and Egyptology into the organization. In large part to hearken back to and acknowledge the greatness of we as a people beyond the age of slavery, and that being focusing on great African empires, the chief among them for alphas would be ancient Kemet or ancient Egypt. And so there's lots of symbolism which you can't explain. I know it, but I can't explain it.
How are the recruitment efforts across college campuses now? Are you primarily drawing from HBCUs or are you drawing from other institutions?
I think the organizations draw, a significant number of individuals on PW, predominantly white institutions, and HBCUs. I think the challenge for the organization, and we, attract members at the alumni level. Cornell West joined through an alumni chapter. There's a judge up there, Eric Clay, who was a federal appellate court judge on the Sixth Circuit out of Detroit. He joined through an alumni chapter. Hubert Humphrey, vice president, he was actually an honorary member. And W.E.B. Du Bois was an honorary member. The honorary members back then were quite different than they would be now. Alpha doesn't have honorary membership, but other organizations do. I think the bigger question is not simply, is one of quantity. One, I think there's less interest in the organizations now than there was, say, in the 80s, certainly in the 50s. And the other issue is quality, right? And so there's one chapter in the book that looks at academic performance of various organizations. And so in that chapter, they look at GPA reports from Greek affairs offices around the country for a particular semester. And they find that, yes, though there's considerable discussion about us being scholars, if you look at GPA reports, that's not quite the case. And some might suggest that joining BGLO is harmful to your academic performance in the sense that, one, staying up all night and being brutalized, it doesn't allow for a good academic environment. You can't really stay awake in class, and sometimes you might not want to go to class if you can't sit down, if your posterior is so bruised. And then the second issue is that once you join, one, there's an expectation that you do all these various things. You're doing various service projects, you're road tripping, you're going to visit other chapters, but you also enter a new social reality. My little sister was dating a guy who was pledging for her. He was pledging Alpha. And of course, when he was pledging, she didn't see much of him. And I said, before he finishes, before he crosses, you need to clarify the nature of, is this your man and he's going to be your man? I said, because when he gets to the other side, I don't care if he was the biggest geek, nerd, uncool guy on campus, he will be in a different social reality. And women will be interested in him simply because of his organizational affiliation. And so you just enter a new social world in which you probably go to more social events, even if you're quiet, because you're asked to be at more social events and your chapter encourages you to be at more social events. And especially for BGLOs, where on many college campuses, an active chapter might only be 5 people, 7 people, 10 people, as compared to predominantly white fraternities and sororities that might have 100, 150 individuals in an active chapter. Any other questions? Well, thank you for coming out.